Today we're looking at sustainable choices, how to make them, but how to do that without getting completely overwhelmed by all the information out there.
Sounds good to me.
So we're really focusing in on kind of this fascinating and sometimes frustrating intersection between food waste, changes in our diet, and what actually makes us change our behavior.
I think you've really hit on something crucial there.
Yeah.
Because, who hasn't felt that twinge of guilt looking at a fridge full of, wilted lettuce?
Oh, all the time.
But what we'll see in the research by Professor Willie LeGrand, who's a hospitality management expert that we'll be talking about today, this goes way beyond just feeling personally guilty. We're talking about whole systems, psychology, and some really thought-provoking contradictions.
Professor LeGrand really got my attention with a stat from the 2024 Food Waste Index report.
Yeah.
It seems like 1 billion meals are wasted globally every day. 1 billion.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's almost too big to really wrap your head around, and I think what's really shocking is the role that the food service industry plays in all of this. A full 28% of that waste happens there. So that's restaurants, hotels, even hospitals, places we all go to, right?
Yeah, which makes those leftover fries feel a little heavier all of a sudden.
More than you know. Because those fries, that takeout container you forgot about, it all adds up. We're talking about 8 to 12% of all greenhouse gases being tied to this food waste.
Yeah.
And get this, 28% of global agricultural land is used to make food that never actually gets eaten. So that's land, water, energy, all for nothing.
Okay, that's really disheartening to hear. But it also makes me wonder about some of the lesser-known culprits in all of this. I know food waste is a big issue at home, but what about in those, massive industrial kitchens? What's going on there?
It's a great question, and it's where things get really interesting. Professor LeGrand points out that overportioning is a big issue in restaurants. And not only does it mean that people are throwing away more food, but those huge portions actually change how we see what a normal portion size is supposed to be.
So it's like a domino effect that then impacts our choices even when we're not eating out.
Exactly. And then there's the problem of aesthetic standards. Did you know that tons of perfectly edible produce never even gets to our plates?
No.
Because it doesn't meet the beauty standards of supermarkets.
Really?
We're talking about carrots that are oddly shaped, apples that might have a blemish.
So it's like the food world has its own version of unrealistic beauty standards.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the consequences are a lot more serious than just a bruised ego. It all goes back to that huge environmental impact that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it is kind of mind-boggling when you think about the fact that, and according to Professor LeGrand, over 780 million people across the globe face hunger every single day. So we have this horrible paradox of way too much and not nearly enough.
Yeah, a paradox that Professor LeGrand thinks that we can work on fixing by not just looking at how much we waste, but also what we choose to eat.
Interesting. Which leads us to this other side of this kind of complicated issue, which is those dietary shifts that we hear so much about. Is it really as easy as just swapping out your burger for a veggie burger?
I wish it were that simple. Professor LeGrand actually takes a deep dive into the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, which basically, and I am simplifying this a bit, but basically it says that we should be eating in a way that's more plant-forward.
Okay, so more whole grains, more fruits and vegetables. I mean, we hear that all the time.
You do, but there's a big difference between knowing something and actually doing it.
That's true.
And what's really interesting about the Eat Lancet report is that it does more than just tell us what's good to eat and what's bad to eat. It really breaks down what our choices actually lead to, you know? Did you know that just to produce 1 kilogram of beef, you need something like 15,000 liters of water?
15,000 liters for 1 kilogram.
For 1 kilogram of beef.
That's a lot of water for one steak.
Yeah. I mean, it really makes you think about things a little differently.
It does.
It shows how everything is connected when it comes to the choices we make about food. We're not just talking about our own health, we're talking about the planet's health too.
So where do we even start? I know that I have trouble with this. Even when I'm really trying to do the right thing, it can be really hard to actually change my behavior. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. The intention-action gap, as they call it.
Yeah, exactly.
It gets us all. And Professor LeGrand spends a lot of time trying to figure out why that is, why humans struggle with this so much. And he uses the terms narrative self and experiencing self to talk about this kind of inner battle that we all face.
Okay. Tell me a little more about these different parts of ourselves.
Sure. So imagine your narrative self is this idealized version of yourself, right? This is the you that reads something like the Eat Lancet report and feels so inspired, and you're like, yes, I want to live more sustainably. I'm going to make good choices that are good for me and the planet.
Okay, so that's me feeling all motivated after I read what Professor Legrand has to say.
Exactly. But then we have this other side, the experiencing self. And that's the part of us that has to deal with the day-to-day.
Right.
And maybe you're stressed out or you just don't have a lot of time, and suddenly ordering takeout sounds like a much better option than making something from scratch, even if you know it's not the best choice.
Oh, I feel so seen right now. And it's not just takeout, is it? It's all
Really?
those little choices we make every day, like grabbing a coffee in a disposable cup when you're rushing, or picking up the individually wrapped snacks at the store.
It is. And here's what's really interesting about it all from like a psychology perspective. Professor Legrand talks about how our brains are basically wired to go for instant gratification rather than long-term rewards. Like we evolved to seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? Which in today's world often means choosing things that are easy and satisfying right now, even if it ends up hurting our values or the environment in the long run.
So we're fighting our own biology in a way.
Kinda, yeah. I mean, our ancestors didn't have to worry about the carbon footprint of their mammoth steak, right?
Sure.
And that's exactly why it's just not enough to tell people to just do better. We have to find ways to deal with these deeper psychological hangups.
So how do we close that gap then between what we want to do and what we actually do?
Yeah.
How do we get our experiencing self on the same page as all those big goals?
Well, Professor Legrand brings up an idea that might have part of the answer, and that's the willingness to sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Okay, before you go any further,
I know.
that word does not exactly make me think of easy, fun changes I can make.
I hear you. But it's not about going without or giving up all the things you enjoy. It's more about rethinking what sacrifice really means. It's about accepting that maybe making choices that line up with what you believe in might mean leaving your comfort zone sometimes, or maybe putting up with a little inconvenience, or maybe even taking a hard look at some habits that don't really serve you or the planet anymore.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean about reframing that word sacrifice. It's like, it's not about giving something up, but getting something better in the long run.
Right.
And maybe that's actually the key to like closing that gap between what we want to do and what we actually end up doing. If we focus on the good stuff, like how delicious those plant-based meals can be, or that sense of community you can find when you join something like a local food co-op,
Right.
or even just the feeling you get knowing that you're making a difference.
Right.
It can make those sustainable choices seem much more appealing.
Yeah, definitely. It's about changing our perspective, going from thinking about what we're missing out on to what we're actually gaining, from feeling guilty to feeling empowered, you know?
Totally.
And it's about recognizing that even these small things that we do, if enough people start doing them, it can actually have a big impact.
And that makes me think about something you mentioned earlier about like changing the system itself. Because even if we figure out how to always do what we think is best, it still feels like there are all these bigger forces at play here, right?
Absolutely. And Professor Legrand really emphasizes that while it's super important for each of us to do our part, it's not enough. We need to look at this from all sides. So we need policies to change, companies need to take responsibility, and we need to be teaching people about this stuff on a much wider scale. Only then can we really build a food system that's sustainable.
So what could that actually look like, in the real world? Does Professor Legrand talk about any initiatives that seem particularly promising?
He does. He talks about France, for instance. Did you know that in France it's actually illegal for supermarkets to throw away food that hasn't been sold?
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, they have to work with charities now to make sure that any food that's still good to eat is given to people who need it.
That makes so much sense. I mean, it seems obvious, but I imagine it probably took a lot to get that going,
Yeah.
both in terms of changing the law and getting people on board with it.
It did, but it shows that it can be done, that we can make these big changes when we're all on the same page and we're willing to actually do something. And it's not just about governments making rules either. Professor Legrand also highlights this growing movement of zero-waste restaurants. Have you heard of them?
Yeah, I've heard of them.
They're finding these really creative ways to shrink their environmental impact. Some of them are composting their food waste, and some are even using it to grow their own produce. Which is amazing, right? It creates this closed loop. It's really inspiring.
It is inspiring. I
Good.
love that. Closing the loop. It seems like there are so many new ideas popping up in this area, which makes me feel hopeful.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be hopeful for. But Professor Legrand also leaves us with one last question to really think about. He quotes this farmer and novelist, Wendell Berry, who wrote, "Much of the litter is fairly directly caused by the massive secession or exclusion of most of our people from active participation in their food economy.
Okay, that's powerful. What do you think Wendell Berry means by people being cut off from the food economy?
I think he's talking about this disconnect so many of us feel like we don't really know where our food comes from or what it took to get it to us. And when we're so far removed from that whole process, from the farms where our food is grown to the people who pick it and prepare it, it becomes way easier to just throw food away.
It's true.
Or to make choices that aren't sustainable because we aren't really facing those consequences.
Yeah. It's a pretty sobering thought. It makes you think about ways to close that gap. How can we feel like we have more control and responsibility in a system that often feels so big and out of our hands?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
And I really do think there are many different ways we can go about trying to answer it. Supporting local farmers markets, learning how to cook, or even just starting a conversation with your friends and family about food waste. These are all things we can do, and they all make a difference.
Right. It goes back to those small actions adding up, right? Like, we might not be able to change the entire system overnight, but we can at least make choices that reflect what we believe in.
Yeah.
And hopefully that inspires the people around us to do the same.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe those small changes will eventually lead to something much bigger.
I love that. It feels good to know that even with all these challenges, we can still make a difference.